Black husband forbade wife from entering the attic for 35 years. What she found changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video. For 35 years, he had forbidden her from setting foot in the attic. After his passing, however, she ascended the stairs and uncovered a truth that reframed her entire existence. The house had sat for generations at the end of a quiet road beyond the town's limits, where sweet gum trees grew untamed and the spring air carried the fragrance of damp earth and magnolia blossoms. Its brick walls were weathered by the passage of time, and the windows, though spotless, seemed coated in a fine layer of remembrance, as if the home itself held too many memories. For most people, it was just another aging southern house, dignified, well-loved, and largely overlooked. But for Ayana, it was the backdrop against which her life had played out, year after year, season after season, tethered to the man she had followed there and the profound silence they had nurtured together. She had first come to that house 35 years prior, a young woman from Baltimore with a drive she couldn't quite articulate and a resilience she had learned to veil behind gentle smiles and crisply ironed dresses. When Elijah brought her to rural Georgia, she imagined it was a temporary arrangement, a brief foray into tranquil living, a concession made for love. But the landscape had a way of seeping into her soul, and the unhurried tempo of the countryside had coaxed her into remaining. In those early days, she was captivated by Elijah's steadiness, his kind disposition, and the calm assurance with which he moved through the world. He was a man who seldom raised his voice, who chose his words with the precision of a bricklayer, and who always looked her directly in the eye when he made a promise. She had never met anyone so thoroughly dependable. Elijah had received the house from his father. While it was neither grand nor ornate, it had been constructed with great care, a two-story home with a wide wraparound porch and a screen door at the back that perpetually slammed shut with a bit too much force. The kitchen carried the scent of pine cleaner and cooking spices, and the floorboards would creak in familiar spots, like a house clearing its throat. Ayana could still recall her first time crossing the threshold. It was late spring, the dogwoods were in magnificent bloom, and Elijah had brought her luggage inside without a word. She had meandered through the rooms, envisioning the life they would create together. Sunday dinners with friends, morning coffee on the porch, stacks of books on every available surface. It all felt fresh and filled with promise. Yet, amidst that hopeful tranquility, one detail emerged that would shadow her through all the years of their marriage: the attic. The hatch to the attic was set flush against the ceiling in the hallway near their bedroom, a plain square of light-colored wood with a brass clasp and a pull cord that dangled just low enough to graze the heads of taller visitors. On their second day there, Ayana had glanced up at it and quipped, asking what secrets he was hiding up there. Elijah's expression shifted, a subtle but definite change. He stated quietly that she was not to go up there, explaining it was unsafe. He mentioned weak floor beams, old dusty boxes, and the possibility of mold, the sort of place where one could easily misstep and get hurt. She didn't push him on it. It was early in their shared life, and she didn't want their story to begin with a confrontation. She simply nodded, smiled, and returned to unpacking their kitchenware. But from that day forward, the attic established itself as a silent presence in her mind, a space just above her that she could not see but was constantly aware of. Over time, the house became theirs in a way that homes do after decades of shared life. Photographs settled into their permanent spots on the walls. Rugs developed faded patches where the sun always struck. The backyard, once a tangled mess of weeds and dense red clay, flourished under Ayana's devoted hands. Life found its comfortable rhythm. Morning toast with marmalade, weekly trips to town for supplies, evenings on the porch listening to the quiet murmur of a jazz station on the radio. Elijah worked at the engine repair shop near the highway, the same one his father had owned, and his hands were always stained with the dark remnants of oil and grime. He arrived home at 6:30 each evening, washed up at the utility sink, and changed into soft shirts that smelled of motor oil and pine-scented soap. He was never late, never forgot to lock up, and never departed without a goodbye. They didn't argue, at least not in the way most people imagine. There were no slammed doors or harsh words exchanged. They had their disagreements, of course, over finances, the stubbornness of their old water heater, or whether to repaint the kitchen. But these disputes always concluded in a tired compromise, a quiet yielding to the established routine. Ayana often pictured their marriage as a slow dance on well-worn floorboards, predictable and rehearsed, but not lacking in a certain grace. And all the while, the attic was left undisturbed. As the years went by, Ayana began to see it less as a mystery and more as a sealed exhibit in a museum, a space too delicate to be disturbed. Still, she couldn't ignore the way Elijah would sometimes glance up at the hatch as he passed through the hallway, his gaze lingering as if he were taking a measurement. On rare occasions, she would awaken in the dead of night to find his side of the bed empty, and she would hear the faintest noises from above, the creak of a single board, the soft rustle of something being moved. When he came back to bed, he offered no explanation, and she did not ask for one. She reasoned that every person deserved a private space. Elijah was not a man of many words, but he had always been truthful. If he said it was unsafe, she believed him. Perhaps he needed that space just as she needed her morning walks or her herb garden, something that was his alone. But a quiet unease lingered, a low hum in the background of their lives. The years accumulated softly. Ayana tracked them in layers. Holidays celebrated, funerals attended, the changing of the porch cushions every spring. The silver in her locks became more prominent, and she let them grow until they brushed her shoulders. Elijah developed a permanent limp after a winter slip on ice, though he seldom spoke of the discomfort. Their routines became more entrenched, their world shrinking gently like a drawstring bag being pulled closed. Folks in town started referring to them as the Jacksons, a single entity. They always attended church together, sat in a pew near the back, and left before the final hymn. When someone's car sputtered and died, they called Elijah. When the community center needed a pan of mac and cheese for a potluck, Ayana made too. Their life was good, solid, but it never expanded. And constantly, above them, the attic waited. It wasn't until the 22nd year of their marriage that Ayana let herself acknowledge that the attic haunted her. It wasn't a ghostly haunting, not one born of fear, but a slow, persistent ache, the feeling that she was being excluded from a part of the man she cherished. She had never touched the hatch, never even made an attempt to open it. But its constant presence, always sealed, just overhead, had become a dull pain in her side. When neighbors discussed renovations, converting attics into spare rooms, Ayana would offer a polite nod and steer the conversation elsewhere. Sometimes she fantasized about ascending the ladder, about discovering boxes filled with old photographs, maybe even letters. A few times she stood directly beneath it, gazing up, her hand hovering near the cord, but she never pulled it. And so it stayed, growing dustier with her silence and more sacred with her self-control. On the surface, their life remained unchanged. Elijah returned at 6:30. Ayana set the table for dinner. They watched the evening news from matching recliners, speaking quietly about the day. But deep down, a part of her longed to know what was housed above them, not from suspicion, but from a deep yearning for connection. She didn't want secrets between them, yet she had come to understand that love sometimes required allowing them to exist. So she continued to smile and nod and dust the baseboards. She hummed while she folded laundry and trimmed the hedges. She placed fresh flowers in the hallway, just below the attic hatch, arranging them like small offerings, and the years rolled on, as quiet as a held breath. One autumn, as the trees began to shed their leaves early and a chill sharpened the evening air, Ayana found herself standing once more beneath the hatch. The hallway was dim, the atmosphere still. She looked up, her heart burdened with questions that were now too old to be asked. She rested a hand against the wall to steady herself, not from any physical lightheadedness, but from something deeper, a feeling gathering inside her, as if a door within her own soul had begun to shake in its frame. She did not yet know what it signified. She did not yet grasp that some doors, once they are opened, can never be closed again. But she would, and soon, because even a silence that has been meticulously maintained for decades must eventually find its voice. The first time Ayana truly let herself picture a child in their home was just after their third wedding anniversary. They had driven into town that Saturday morning for groceries, a weekly ritual. At the checkout line of the small market, she saw a young mother with a toddler balanced on her hip. The little boy had wide, curious brown eyes and chubby fingers that were gripping the collar of his mother's blouse. The woman said little, offering only a gentle smile to the cashier, but the weight of that tiny hand, the way the child nestled into her as if they were a single being, lingered with Ayana all day. When they returned home, as Elijah unloaded groceries from the car, she stood in the kitchen holding a bag of rice and gazed out at their empty yard. Her fingers instinctively tightened around the bag, and for a brief moment, she imagined it was the warm, breathing weight of a small child. They never had a formal discussion about starting a family. There were no solemn conversations or lists of potential names. It began with a shared glance one evening as she rested her head on his shoulder on the porch swing. He covered her hand with his and held it there just a beat longer than usual. It was a silent understanding, like most things between them, a gentle turn towards the prospect of more. In the months that followed, Ayana lived in a state of hopeful watchfulness. She drank less coffee, read articles on prenatal health, and started to notice every infant at church, every stroller she passed on the sidewalk. The concept of motherhood felt both deeply personal and impossibly distant, like a song she could almost recall but couldn't quite hum. She kept their efforts private, telling no one. Not her friends from the book club, not the neighbor down the street who had 4 children and an ever-open door. It felt too fragile, too sacred to be spoken aloud. Time marched on. She purchased her first pregnancy test with trembling hands, carrying it home in a paper bag hidden beneath a carton of milk and a loaf of bread. The result was negative. She convinced herself it was simply too soon. They continued trying. Another month passed, another test, another starkly blank result. After a while, she stopped buying the tests altogether. She couldn't stand the silent judgment anymore, the way each one seemed to measure not just her biology, but her hope. Elijah never made her feel responsible. He never uttered a word of blame, but he also offered little in the way of comfort. When she suggested they see a doctor, he would nod in agreement and drive her to appointments. But his expression was always distant, his body present, but his mind elsewhere. In sterile waiting rooms, he would sit with his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on posters illustrating fetal development and smiling, soft-focused families. Ayana filled out the endless forms. Elijah simply signed his name where required. They saw specialists in Macon and later in Atlanta. They heard the term unexplained infertility so many times it lost all meaning. It was a uniquely clinical form of cruelty, being told that nothing was medically wrong, yet nothing was happening. They both passed every exam, met every benchmark, and still the months slipped by without any change. Ayana began to feel alienated from her own body. The vessel she had always trusted without a second thought now felt like a stranger, uncooperative and flawed. She wondered if Elijah experienced the same sense of letdown, if in the quiet spaces that stretched between them, he also carried the heavy ache of absence. But he never spoke of it. He would come home from the shop, kiss her cheek, and eat his dinner as if their unspoken sorrow was just another piece of furniture in the house. Eventually, the silence between them on this subject became its own form of communication. She stopped tracking her cycle, stopped marking dates on the calendar. The ache subsided to a dull throb, but it never truly disappeared. It was like the low hum of the refrigerator, a sound you only notice when the house falls completely silent. She folded laundry, prepared meals, and tended her garden. She did everything she had done before, but now with a weight on her heart that no amount of routine could ever fully lift. Elijah retreated even further into himself. He still brought her coffee in the morning and fixed things around the house, but his quietness had deepened. Sometimes she would find him gazing out the window at the distant tree line, his face a mask of contemplation. On other nights, She would wake up to find him gone, only to hear the soft click of the back door a few minutes later. He always came back without a word, and she never asked where he had been. The question felt too delicate, as if asking it might shatter the fragile peace that held them together. One day, about 6 years into their marriage, Ayana bought a crib. She told herself it was an impulse buy, but she had walked past the antique shop 3 times before finally stepping inside. It was made of simple wood, painted white, with worn corners and a gentle creak when rocked. She had it delivered while Elijah was at work and hid it in a spare room behind boxes of old books and winter clothes. She never mentioned it to him. Sometimes, when she was alone in the house, she would pull back the sheet covering it and trace the smooth rail with her fingertips. Then she would cover it again and quietly leave the room. They never discussed adoption. The topic sometimes hovered in the air between them, a ghostly possibility, but neither of them ever reached for it. Perhaps they were both afraid of what it would unleash. The years had taught them to live alongside their sadness, to tuck it away into corners and navigate around it like a loose floorboard. They didn't fight about it. They simply allowed the silence to deepen its roots. Ayana took a part-time job at the local library. The tranquility suited her. She loved the smell of old paper, the satisfying order of the shelves, and the hush that settled over the building like a comforting blanket. She helped organize community events and occasionally read stories to groups of children. Those were the most difficult days. The sound of their small voices, the patter of their feet on the tile floor. It pierced her carefully constructed composure like a shard of glass. She always smiled and thanked the parents, but when she returned home, she would sometimes sit in the quiet kitchen for hours, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea, staring at nothing. Elijah continued on, his rhythms unwavering. He mended things. He oiled squeaky hinges, patched the roof, and replaced the gutters. He filled his days with repairs, and Ayana filled hers with schedules. They moved in parallel, 2 lines that never converged. The attic seemed to grow in significance during those years. Ayana found her gaze drifting toward the hatch more frequently, drawn to it by something that felt like a painful longing. She never touched the cord, but the air beneath it always felt charged, as if the space above held not just dust and insulation, but something more profound: history, grief, the residue of deferred dreams. One afternoon, while dusting the hallway, she placed a step stool beneath the hatch to clean the ceiling. Her hand brushed against the brass latch, and for a fleeting second, she considered pulling it down. But she stopped herself, her heart hammering in her chest. She climbed down slowly, ashamed of her own trembling hands. Later that week, she brought up the attic casually during dinner, just to gauge Elijah's reaction. He didn't look up from his meal. He said it wasn't a place she needed to concern herself with, that there was nothing up there of any importance. His tone was level, but it held a note of finality. She nodded and let it go. Still, the attic's presence became almost a physical force in her life. She started avoiding that part of the hallway at night. She caught herself glancing up every time she passed by. In her dreams, she often stood before it with a key in her hand, the wooden hatch glowing in a single beam of light. But whenever she reached to open it, she would wake up. Ayana told herself it was just a room, just wood and nails and insulation. But she knew it was more than that. It had become a vessel, not only for whatever Elijah kept inside it, but for all the things they had left unsaid. It held the weight of their years together, of their unmet hopes, of a grief that was never given a voice. Their marriage never broke, but something within it had curled inward like a leaf in a drought. They functioned, they lived side by side, but the intimacy that had once flowed between them had faded to a pale echo. She still loved him. That had never been in question, but it was a love steeped in melancholy, wrapped in resignation. And the attic remained above them, unopened, unseen, and unbearably present. The autumn light shifted slowly that year, the way it always did in Georgia, becoming gradual and golden, filtering through the thinning leaves like a visible memory. The trees behind the house turned a fiery orange, then a brilliant gold, before finally releasing their leaves like long-held secrets. By then, Ayana had lost her passion for gardening. The herbs had gone to seed, the flowers had browned, and the hydrangeas she usually tended so carefully had started to wilt on their stems. She no longer moved with her old rhythm. Her days had a different weight, a more measured slowness. Elijah was changing. It started so gradually she almost missed it. A low groan when he pushed himself up from the dinner table, a hand pressed against his side after a short walk. He would wince when reaching for something on a high shelf, then dismiss her concern with a wave of his hand. He insisted it was just old age. "These old bones are getting creaky," he'd say with a chuckle that never quite reached his eyes. He started taking more naps. His appetite waned. One day, she noticed he had tightened his belt to the very last hole. Ayana had lived with silence long enough to hear the things that went unsaid, but she also knew her husband. Elijah was not a man to admit to pain unless it became overwhelming. He was the kind of man who would work through a fever or build a fence with a sprained ankle. His quiet strength had once been a source of comfort for her. Now, it deeply unnerved her. She began to observe him more intently. At dinner, he would just push food around his plate. In the evenings, he no longer worked on the loose porch step he had been meaning to fix for months. Sometimes she would find him staring into the distance, lost in a private thought he would not share. His shoulders, once so broad and steady, now seemed to slop. She urged him to see a doctor. Once, then twice. The third time, she informed him that she had scheduled an appointment for him. He didn't argue. That frightened her more than anything else. They drove to the clinic on a Thursday morning. The waiting room felt cold, and the soft yellow on the walls, meant to be calming, felt sterile. Ayana filled out the paperwork while Elijah sat silently beside her. She could feel the tension coiled in his body beneath his placid expression. When the nurse called his name, he rose and gave Ayana a faint, reassuring smile before he disappeared down the hall. She waited. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. A young mother across the room read quietly to her child, whose laughter briefly cut through the heavy silence. Ayana folded and unfolded a brochure about heart health until the paper grew soft at the creases. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was professional but grave. He led them to a small consultation room. The words were delivered slowly, carefully, as if navigating through broken glass. Pancreatic cancer. Advanced. Inoperable. Ayana sat frozen, holding her breath as time seemed to collapse. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The diagnosis echoed in her mind, a senseless, crushing weight. When she looked over at Elijah, he was simply nodding. There was no shock, no fear, just the quiet acceptance of a man who had already come to terms with his own mortality. The drive home was shrouded in silence. The fields were brown from the first frost, and the sun hung low in the sky. Ayana stared out her window, her hands gripping the edge of her coat. Elijah drove with both hands on the wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they arrived home, he went straight to their bedroom. She remained in the kitchen, her hands still shaking, her eyes on the coffee mug he had used that morning. It was cold now, half full, with a faint ring at the bottom. She didn't cry. Not yet. In the days that followed, Elijah declined all further treatment. No chemotherapy, no operations, no hospital stays. He told her he didn't want to spend his final days under fluorescent lights, tethered to machines. He wanted to be in his own bed, drinking from his own cup, listening to the wind in the trees. Ayana did not protest. She couldn't. His voice held a gentle but unshakable finality, and she loved him too much to fight his last wish. So she became his caregiver. She read every pamphlet, called every helpline, and filled their pantry with soft foods and medication. She kept a notebook to track his dosages and temperatures, and she learned how to change the bed linens without disturbing him. She moved through the days with the quiet efficiency of a nurse, but her heart ached with every task. Their world shrank to the confines of the house. He slept more. His steps grew slower. The porch swing remained still. He spoke less, but on his better days, he would make a quiet, dry joke that reminded her of the man he had been. He would reach for her hand and let his fingers linger in hers. Those small moments were her sustenance. One evening, as she was helping him get comfortable in his chair on the porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow on his face, he reached out and took her wrist. His grip was frail, but the gesture was full of meaning. His eyes met hers, and they held an urgent, deeply personal plea. "If anything happens to me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "promise me you won't go up there." It took her a second to realize he was talking about the attic. A chill ran through her, not of fear, but of profound significance. He offered no more explanation, his gaze steady and unwavering. Ayana nodded. The words were caught in her throat, but she managed to say them. She promised. That night, as she helped him into bed, he whispered something she could barely hear. She had to lean close. "I kept it for us," he murmured. "You may not understand, but I had to." She didn't sleep that night. Her thoughts circled around the ceiling, the hatch, his cryptic words. What could he have possibly kept for them? What was so precious that it had to be kept secret, even as he faced the end? The following week was a blur. Elijah grew weaker. Some days he barely opened his eyes. On others, he held her hand for hours in silence. Ayana stopped measuring time by clocks and started measuring it by his breaths, by the quiet hum of their home. One morning, just before dawn, he slipped away. There was no struggle, just a final, gentle exhale that did not follow with an inhale. His hand, once so strong, lay open in hers like a fallen leaf. Ayana sat with him for hours. She didn't call anyone at first. She brushed back his hair, whispered to him, and held his hand until it grew cold. Finally, the calls were made and the arrangements began. The funeral was a small affair, with a few neighbors and a cousin from Alabama he barely knew. The pastor's words were kind, but they felt distant. She stood alone by the grave, the wind pulling at her coat as his casket was lowered into the earth. She did not cry. Grief had not yet found its form. Back home, the house greeted her with the acute emptiness that follows a profound loss. His slippers were by the door, his razor on the shelf, his favorite mug on the drying rack. Every object pulsed with his absence. And above it all, the attic remained. She tried to ignore it. She threw herself into sorting his belongings, clothes, books, tools. But every drawer she opened seemed to release his memory back into the room. His handwriting on an old receipt, the scent of cedar from his closet. The attic was louder now, not in sound, but in its sheer presence. It seemed to be calling to her. At night, she would lie in bed and stare at the hatch, her eyes tracing its outline in the dim light. She would wake from dreams of soft, steady footsteps on the ceiling, her heart pounding. The promise she had made to him felt like a stone on her chest. She had said she wouldn't go up there. But with each passing day, the vow felt heavier, the mystery more urgent. One evening, sitting alone on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her, she whispered his name into the darkness. The wind rustled the leaves, and for a moment, she could almost feel him beside her. She closed her eyes, trying to summon the warmth of his presence, but it was fading into memory. What had he kept for them? Why the secrecy, even now? She didn't yet know that the answer was waiting just beyond the latch, a truth that was patient, preserved, and full of a love she couldn't yet comprehend. But she would find it, and when she did, everything would change. For 3 days following the funeral, Ayana moved through the house like a phantom. The silence was no longer comfortable or familiar. It was vast and empty. Her own footsteps seemed to reverberate more loudly than before, and the old floorboards groaned beneath her feet, not with their usual comforting sounds, but as if in protest. She found herself moving cautiously through rooms she had known for decades, afraid to disrupt the stillness Elijah had left in his wake. By force of habit, she made coffee for 2 each morning. It was only when she was halfway to the porch that she would remember there was no one to hand the second mug to. The cup would sit on the counter, slowly growing cold, a silent testament to her new reality. She couldn't bring herself to wash his favorite mug. It still bore the faint impression of his last use, a small stain of coffee on the rim. The flannel shirts he wore were still hanging in the laundry room, and they still carried his scent. She pressed her face into one and stood there for a long time, her eyes wide open, unblinking. She filled her days with motion to keep the grief at bay. She sorted drawers that were already organized, refolded towels, and cleaned out the refrigerator. She vacuumed corners and polished picture frames that were already gleaming. But every mundane task felt like a slow, circular journey that always ended in the same hallway, beneath the same wooden square in the ceiling, confronted by the same heavy silence that pressed on her ribs, the attic. She thought she could ignore it. At first, she actively avoided the hallway, taking longer routes through the kitchen to get from the living room to the bedroom. But the house was not large enough for her to evade it for long. Inevitably, her gaze would drift upwards. The pull cord would sway slightly in a draft, and the immense weight of what lay behind it would settle on her shoulders once more. She had made a promise. She had spoken the words while Elijah's fading hand was on her wrist. But now that he was gone, the promise felt less like a sacred pact and more like a chain, anchoring her to a mystery she could no longer bear. What could he have possibly hidden that was so important? And why, in all their years together, had he not trusted her with it? On the fourth night, she awoke with a jolt. It was still dark outside, and a strong wind rattled the window panes. She sat bolt upright in bed and felt a distinct shift in the house. It wasn't a physical change, nothing she could see or touch, but something in the atmosphere had altered. The weight of the silence felt different. She walked barefoot into the hallway, the hem of her nightgown brushing against her ankles, and stopped directly beneath the attic hatch. The cord hung motionless. She stared at it for a long time, her heart thumping in her chest, before she turned and walked away. She told herself it was just her grief playing tricks on her, that the attic had always been there and would be there tomorrow. But sleep did not come back to her that night. The next morning, she lingered over her coffee, staring out the kitchen window at a backyard blurred by her tears. For the first time since he passed, she whispered into the emptiness, "Elijah, why did you keep me out?" Later that afternoon, while putting fresh linens away, her hand brushed against a small stack of envelopes in his nightstand. Most were old bills or scribbled notes, but one was different. It was unmarked, sealed, and tucked away beneath a pile of receipts, as if placed there deliberately. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside was a small, cold brass key. Ayana stared at it resting in her palm, her breath catching in her throat. It could only be for the padlock on the attic. She closed her hand around it, the metal pressing into her skin, and sat there for a long while. She didn't go up immediately. That night, she left the key on the kitchen table and went to bed. She told herself that promises mattered, that she needed to wait. But the truth was, she was afraid, not of what she might discover, but of what that discovery would do to her. The next morning, she woke before dawn. The sky was a soft, pre-dawn gray. Acting on pure instinct, she slipped into one of Elijah's old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled clumsily above her wrists. She didn't put on shoes. The cool hardwood felt familiar under her bare feet. The house was still as she walked to the kitchen. The key was on the table where she had left it, its brass catching the faint light. She picked it up, her grip tight. In the hallway, she stood beneath the hatch and looked up. For 35 years, she had passed this spot without ever touching the cord. Now, she reached for it. The folding ladder descended with a soft groan, sending a flutter of dust into the air like an exhaled breath. She climbed slowly, each step creaking under her weight, but the structure held firm. When her head emerged through the opening, she paused, her heart racing. Then, she pulled herself up into the attic. The air was warmer than she had anticipated, and it smelled of aged wood, dust, and something faintly sweet like old paper. Thin beams of morning light pierced through two narrow windows at either end of the room. As her eyes adjusted, she saw them. They were everywhere. Portraits, dozens of them, all of children. Some were sketched in pencil, others rendered in soft pastels or vibrant acrylics, each one lovingly detailed and unique. There were children smiling, children with solemn faces, children with tight braids, soft waves, or big, beautiful afros. Many of them had eyes so strikingly familiar, so clearly her own, that she gasped. Ayana moved slowly between them, as if walking through a dream. They hung on the slanted walls, were propped on easels, and leaned against old furniture. They filled the attic like a silent, watchful congregation. Boys and girls, babies and toddlers, children of every age she and Elijah had ever hoped for. None of them were real, and yet, in Elijah's art, they had been brought to life. She reached out to touch a frame, then stopped herself, her hand shaking. On the far wall, painted in careful, large letters, were the words, "For us her knees gave way," and she sank to the floor. She looked around the room at the drawings, the thoughtful arrangement of toys in the corners, a worn blanket folded next to an old wooden chair. In the far corner stood a crib. It was real, handmade, sanded smooth, and painted white. The paint was chipped in a few places, revealing the bare wood underneath. Inside, a small, handmade elephant made of kente cloth sat propped against a pillow. Its eyes were buttons, and one of its ears drooped slightly. Ayana's breath caught in a sob. She pressed a hand to her mouth. She didn't know how long she sat there on the floor. Eventually, she got her feet and walked towards the wall of portraits. Beneath a drawing of a little girl with two proud afro puffs and a wide, toothy smile, a name was written in careful script, Amina. Next to her was another drawing labeled Omari, then Zuri, then Kwame. Each name was different, each child distinct, and all of them existed only here. On the floor beside the crib lay a sketchbook. She picked it up. Its pages were filled from edge to edge with drawings. A baby crawling, a toddler stacking blocks, a young child curled up in her mother's lap. There were sketches of a little boy in Elijah's workshop, watching him work. Others showed a girl in a library, her face alight with wonder as she held a picture book. There were dates scribbled in the margins, imagined birthdays and milestones. Ayana closed her eyes as the tears began to fall, first softly, then in racking sobs. She sank to her knees beside the crib, clutching the notebook to her chest. All these years, Elijah had kept this secret, not out of cruelty or shame, but out of a profound and hidden heartbreak. He had built a world where their children could exist, if only in his imagination. He had painted their faces, their lives, their joys. He had loved them into being when reality had denied them chance. And he had done it all by himself. She wept not just for the children they never had, but for the man who had carried that immense sorrow in silence, who had transformed it into something beautiful and hidden it away in the rafters above their life. When her tears finally subsided, Ayana looked around the attic again. It no longer felt like a forbidden space. It felt like Elijah. It felt like his steady hands, his quiet breath, his unspoken grief. She reached out and touched the cloth elephant in the crib. The fabric was soft under her fingers. Then she sat back, closed the sketchbook, and whispered into the still, quiet air. "I see them." The attic did not answer, but the light seemed to grow a little warmer, and for the first time in a long time, she did not feel alone. The attic, once a place of mystery, had become a sanctuary. Ayana went back the next morning, this time bringing a cup of hot coffee with her. She climbed the ladder with a slow reverence, as if entering a sacred space. The light filtering through the small windows was softer today, and dust motes danced in the sunbeams like tiny, peaceful spirits. She walked with a new sense of purpose, studying the portraits with eyes that now understood a language she had once been afraid to learn. She knew these children were not real in a physical sense, but they felt real in the way that memories do, stitched together from love and longing. She whispered their names aloud, Amina, Omari, Zuri, letting each one settle in the quiet room like a prayer. As she explored further, she noticed a stack of spiral-bound notebooks next to the crib. The covers were faded and worn. She knelt and picked up the one on top. The blue cover was pale, the metal spiral spotted with rust. She opened it to the first page. At the top, in blocky, deliberate handwriting, were the words, "Diary of a Father. For you, my child, if you ever find this," her breath hitched. She sat down on the wooden floor, cross-legged, and began to read. The first entries were hesitant, as if Elijah was testing his own voice in the dark. He wrote about building the crib by hand, how he had sanded the wood smooth after it split, determined to make it perfect. He wrote about his fears, not just of being a father, but putting too much faith in something that might never happen. I needed to do something with my hands, one entry read. Something to give hope a shape to hold. Ayana turned the pages, each one revealing a hidden layer of the man she had lived beside for 35 years. Elijah wrote to their imagined child, sometimes a daughter, sometimes a son. He pictured their first words, their laughter, the weight of them sleeping on his chest. He described stories he would have read to them and lessons he would have taught about kindness, courage, and how to fix a leaky faucet. One entry struck her deeply. Your mother planted hibiscus today. She looked so tired. I wanted to tell her I still had hope, but the words wouldn't come. So I came up here and wrote them to you instead. The tears returned, but they were softer this time, born not of shock, but of a deep, aching understanding. Elijah hadn't hidden the attic from her. He had been protecting her and himself. It had been his way of shouldering their shared sorrow. Where she had retreated into silence, he had built a world. In another entry, from about 10 years earlier, he described a dream. He was teaching a small boy to ride a bicycle on a gravel path behind their house. The boy fell, scraped his knee, but got back up, smiling. I woke up with my heart hurting, he wrote. I almost told your mother about it. I should have. But then I thought, maybe this dream is just for me. Ayana pressed her fingers to the page, feeling the faint indentations of his pen. As she continued reading, the entries grew more detailed. He documented imaginary birthdays with elaborate cakes, scraped knees, and lost teeth. He gave the children different names at different times. Amara, Kofi, Nia, Tariq. Each name carried its own personality. Nia loved peaches. Tariq hated being cold. Amara wanted to be an artist. Kofi loved the sound of the rain. She found an entry that made her pause. I know you will never read this, but maybe writing it helped me believe you existed, even if only in this room, even if only in me. Ayana closed the notebook, holding it to her chest. The ache was profound, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the love he had poured into every sentence, with the beauty of what he had created from their loss. She reached for the next notebook. This one was thinner and filled with tiny pictures cut from magazines. Children playing, sleeping, smiling. Beside each picture, he had written a caption as if narrating a family photo album. Your first steps, he wrote beneath a picture of a toddler. Reading with your mom was next to a picture of a woman and child with a book. In a margin of one page, he had written, sometimes I imagine you asking me why I made all this. I think I would tell you it was because I had nowhere else to put all the love. Ayana remained in the attic for hours, the light shifting around her unnoticed. She moved from one notebook to the next, absorbing the layers of his hope and his sorrow. He had never stopped writing, even as his body began to fail him. In one of the last notebooks, his handwriting was shaky and cramped. You won't know me, not really. One of the final entries began. But I knew you. I knew every part of you, even though I never saw your face. I heard your laughter on the wind. I imagine your hand gripping my finger. You were mine, and I am so sorry I couldn't make you real. She sat perfectly still after reading that, the words echoing in her chest. She realized then that the attic was not just a refuge. It was a monument. It was a testament not to tragedy, but to the depth of a man's love. Her grief transformed in that moment. It didn't disappear, but found a new shape. She stood and looked around the room again. The toys, the blankets, the drawings, they were all part of a conversation, a life lived in secret. She traced the edge of a small wooden drum and gently touched a crayon drawing of a stick figure family pinned to a beam. Above it, in large letters, it said, "For Mom and Dad." I love you, she wept again, but the tears felt like a gentle rain after a long drought. When she finally descended the ladder, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by love. That evening, she returned to the attic, not as an intruder, but as its new keeper. She brought a soft cloth and a small broom. She dusted the shelves, wiped the picture frames, and opened the windows to let in the evening air. She moved with a gentle purpose, as if tending to something precious and alive. Before she left, she sat in the rocking chair, the one that creaked in a familiar way, and watched the light fade. She didn't need any more answers. She had found the truth, and it was more than enough. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a fresh, blank notebook. She opened it to the first page and began to write. My name is Ayana. Today, I met our children. They were never strangers because they lived in him in this room, and now they live in me. The attic was quiet, but it felt full. The days began to find their rhythm again, not with the numb emptiness that followed Elijah's death, but with the quiet fullness of a life with purpose. Ayana rose early, making 2 cups of coffee as always. Now the second cup came with her up to the attic. It had become her space, just as it had been his. But where Elijah had used it to harbor his secret sorrow, Ayana was transforming it into a place of shared memory. Each morning, she would climb the ladder, a notebook in her hand, and settle into the rocking chair. The room felt lived in now, its quiet softened from grief to reverence. She would read Elijah's words, and then she would add her own, writing to the children who had lived so vividly in his heart. She told them about her day, about the blue jays at the feeder, about the quiet love she had shared with their father. She described him with a gentle clarity, acknowledging his silences but always returning to the deep, patient love that had defined him. Her grief was still present, but it no longer had sharp edges. It had woven itself into the fabric of her days. She swept the attic floor, brought fresh flowers from her garden, and began to read aloud from the picture books Elijah had collected, her voice soft in the still air. As spring warmed into summer, Ayana slowly began to reconnect with the world outside. She walked into town more often, and one morning at the market, she found herself helping a young mother struggling with a restless toddler and a bag of groceries. She steadied the child on his mother's hip, and the woman's grateful smile sparked something warm inside her. A few days later, the librarian called, asking if she would be willing to help with the summer story hour. Ayana hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. That night, she went to the attic, pulled one of Elijah's notebooks from the shelf, and whispered, "I think you'd want this." The first story hour was nerve-wracking, but as she began to read, the children's bright, attentive faces drew her in. Their unrestrained laughter filled the room, and for the first time in years, Ayana laughed with them, a deep, genuine laugh that brought tears to her eyes. She started spending more time at the library, and then, quietly, she reached out to the local foster care agency. At first, she just helped organize donations, but soon she was asked to sit with children during visitations, reading to them and helping with puzzles. She didn't talk much, but the children responded to her calm presence, the way she knelt to meet their gaze and remembered their favorite stories. They were all hungry for a little bit of safety, a little bit of care. Ayana gave what she could, and in return, they gave her a place to pour all the love that had been stored in the attic for so many years. One afternoon, while cleaning, she found a small wooden box tucked away. Inside were dozens of folded slips of paper. Each one had a name, and on the back, a short description. Omari asks too many questions. Amara, quiet laugh. Tariq, always barefoot. It was as if Elijah had imagined 1,000 children and given each one a space in his heart. She spread the slips out on the floor, then gathered them into a large glass jar and placed it by the crib, a constellation of children, never born but never forgotten. That night, she sat on the porch as the sun set. The jar of names glowed in the attic window, lit by a small lamp she'd placed there. The world felt still, but not empty. On her kitchen table was a flyer for a foster agency picnic. They needed volunteers. Ayana picked up a pen and signed her name. She slept soundly and dreamed of Elijah, young and strong again. He stood beside her in the attic, one hand on the crib, the other on her shoulder. He didn't speak, but she felt his love in the gentle weight of his touch. A week later, at a puppet show in the town square, a small boy with tousled hair wandered away from his group and, without a word, climbed into her lap. He leaned against her as if they had known each other forever. Ayana simply put her arms around him and watched the rest of the show, her heart full in a way that surprised her. It wasn't exactly joy, it was peace. That evening, back in the attic, she sat in her rocking chair and opened her notebook. "You never lived in this house," she wrote. "Not in the way we dreamed. But you lived in him, and now you live in me. You were loved. You were loved. That makes you real." The attic held its silence as the stars appeared outside the narrow window. She closed the notebook and placed it gently on the shelf next to his. She sat for a while longer, wrapped in the quiet, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breathing. When she finally stood and turned out the light, the room felt not like an ending, but like a beginning.